The House will come to order. Members, please take your seats. Sergeant at Arms.
The House is now in session. All persons not entitled to privileges on the floor, please retire to the gallery.
The members will rise and be led in prayer by the Reverend David J. Cox, pastor of the King Memorial Community Church, Oriskany, and remaining standing for the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, led by the gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox.
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, how we thank you for your grace and mercy. In your goodness, you have loved us with a sacrificial love. May our lives mirror that love. As we gather together, quiet our hearts to hear your counsel in preparation to do your will. Bless these here who give their all to serve others. Grant to each wisdom and a will to do that which is right in your sight. Free our minds from that which would distract us, and allow us to stand tall and sure in the confidence of our service for you. May we have courage to voice our convictions, along with patience to hear those we may disagree with. Help us to have lives seasoned with grace and respect of others. Our Father, we desire to represent you in how we think and speak and act. And now through the efforts of this esteemed body, may peace and hope flow like the rivers of our land, and like the strong mountains of our beloved state of Virginia, may your righteousness be our foundation. O Lord our God, bless these your chosen servants in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The members will answer the roll call by indicating their presence on the electronic voting board. The clerk will close the roll.
Mr. Speaker, a quorum is present.
Pursuant to House Rule 3, I've examined and approved the Journal of Delegates for March 2nd, 2016. Motions and resolutions under Rule 39 are now in order. Does the clerk have any announcements or communications?
Several announcements, Mr. Speaker. Simply remind the body that all requests for drafts, redrafts, and corrections for joint, commending, or memorial resolutions are due over to Legislative Services by 5 o'clock tomorrow, Friday. Likewise, all requests to be removed as a co-patron are due to the clerk's front desk staff here by 5 tomorrow. In addition, Speaker appoints two sets of conferees. For House Bill 681, Speaker appoints on behalf of the House delegates Leftwich, Hugo, and Ward. For House Bill 681, House conferees will be delegates Leftwich, Hugo, and Ward. And for House Bill 752, Speaker appoints on behalf of the House delegates Bell of Albemarle, Gilbert, and McClellan. For House Bill 752, delegates Bell of Albemarle, Gilbert, and McClellan.
The gentleman from Westmoreland, Ms. Ranson.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a request.
Gentlewoman has the floor.
I'd like to request that the journal reflect my seatmate, the gentleman from Washington, is away due to pressing personal business.
Journal will so reflect.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Stafford, Mr. Dudenheffer.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for two requests.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, may the journal reflect that my seatmate from Suffolk is away on pressing personal business.
Journal will so reflect.
Mr. Speaker, I also rise to request unanimous consent to introduce a joint resolution past the filing deadline. Explain.
Gentlemen, want to mention what the...
Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, the resolution I'm presenting for your unanimous consent is part of a vital national initiative to change the way we address what has been formerly known as post-traumatic stress disorder and changing our current day of awareness to a properly named Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Awareness Day.
That's good. The gentleman from Stafford, Mr. Dudenheffer, asks for unanimous consent to introduce a House joint resolution after the introductory deadline. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That motion is agreed to. The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Plum.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for point of personal privilege.
The gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I was a bit concerned as the way our session ended yesterday, and I thought it might be valuable to go back and reflect for a couple moments on what happened and what it means for us as we go forward. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I don't intend to argue the merits of a Supreme Court nominee. That nominee's qualifications are unchallenged. She was yesterday one of the best candidates we've seen for the Supreme Court in many a day, and she remains that today, Mr. Speaker. The point is not her qualifications. The point is the actions of the House and how we go about doing our business. And Mr. Speaker, I must say to you, I have some concern about the way we conducted our business yesterday. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, it is the case that when we have nominations for judgeships, we put those through in a resolution. Those resolutions are presented to, that resolution is presented to us, and the Speaker poses the question, those in favor of the nominee for Justice of the Supreme Court will vote aye. It was with some amazement that I witnessed something I had never seen in the years that I've been on this floor, and that was you, Mr. Speaker, and 55 of your colleagues casting a no vote. What makes that exceptional is that vote has no meaning in terms of the count, because the constitutional requirements for selection requires a majority of each house of those voting aye. The no vote doesn't count. It's an election, not the passage of a bill, and that's why we go with the ayes. Now, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I sat on this floor for many a year. When I came here in 1978, there were 78 Democrats, 17 Republicans, and 5 independents. And periodically it would be the case that someone would get their nose bent out of shape, they'd get upset about something, they'd want to have a fight on the floor, and the reaction was sometimes inappropriate. But Mr. Speaker, you'll recall some of those people in the past who would then stand up in the minority and call to task the majority and suggest that what they had witnessed was an arrogance of power. And for more than a decade, I heard that theme and witnessed what was an arrogance of power. I might point out to you, it didn't work too well for us. While we may have been cutesy on that particular day, ultimately the people made a judgment that that kind of action is not appropriate. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I think I witnessed again yesterday the arrogance of power. We sometimes do things because we can. Not necessarily because it's a good idea, but simply because we have the power to do it. But what we do when we do that is we affect our institution. We affect the way people view the House of Delegates. We affect how it will be that we go forward in our business in the future. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm sad today because I really think we took some luster off of the image and reputation of the House of Delegates. I think we did ourselves a disservice yesterday, which was actually kind of pointless. There were only 38 votes in favor. So what is the message we're sending with 56 votes that are not going to be counted? I believe that if you were in my position today and I had been part of a majority back as we were back in the beginning of my career, you would have said, that's an arrogance of power. And it's an arrogance of power when you're in power, but it also affects how people look at us. And this is really the sad commentary. I always like to be able to go home and talk about what we've done and say, well, we're not like those people up in Washington. We're not like those people in Washington. I'm not sure I can say that anymore. Because what I believe I witnessed yesterday on the floor was, in fact, a manifestation of the kind of thing that you see in Washington all the time. I think our institution is diminished by what happened yesterday. I'm saddened by that. And Mr. Speaker, as I've expressed to you before, I hope the House will have the leadership to be led in such a way that we will not see this kind of arrogance in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Manassas, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to address a few of the comments the gentleman from Reston that he just made about arrogance of power. And I'm a little bit, I guess I'm not dismayed, but I do think that that is going a stretch too far. Mr. Speaker, I have not been here nearly as long as the gentleman from Reston, but I have seen no votes go up on that board for judges in the past. And quite frankly, it seems like it's faux outrage. This is a simple case of the majority of this body already having preferred a different person for the Virginia Supreme Court, a person that the majority of this body believes is a little bit better qualified than the justice that the governor had put up as an interim appointment. I can't understand why the media has said that that we're angrily responded when this justice was put up, because there was no anger involved in it. I don't think there was anyone on this side that believed Jane Roush was not qualified when she was initially appointed. I believe we all believed she was qualified. I think she may have disqualified herself when she accepted what many believe was an unconstitutional appointment. But again, there was no anger on this side. There was no indignity or outrage. It's a simple fact that there's another candidate for the Supreme Court that we believe is superior. A candidate that already had appellate experience, something that Justice Roush did not have. A candidate that had the full endorsement of all of the major bar associations. Justice Roush had all but one full endorsement. So again, it's still baffling to me, this faux outrage, simply about a judge who the majority of this body thinks is superior in quality to Justice Roush, who again, this side thinks is a fine judge. It's just not our pick. So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday was not anything that hurt this institution, this body. It was just how the business of this body goes forward. And it was this body doing its job under the Virginia Constitution on choosing who our justices shall be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Halifax, Mr. Edmonds.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for introduction.
The gentleman has the floor.
Sorry. Mr. Speaker, today in the gallery we have with us the participants of Project LEAD with Sentara Halifax Regional Hospital. Led by Vance Midget, they are Jackie Arnold, Lynn Bright, Shardine Burton, Stella Hudson, Christy Newton, and Joe Trickey. The group is here today learning about the legislative process, and I ask that they rise and please join me in giving the participants of Project LEAD a warm house welcome.
Delighted to have the visitors from Halifax with us today. The gentleman, Prince William, Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, yesterday morning we had our weekly meeting of the General Assembly Military and Veterans Caucus. And during the meeting, we heard from Major General Tim Williams, who is the Adjutant General of Virginia. In that capacity, is the commander of the Virginia National Guard, both air and ground forces. He was freshly returned from an Army and Air Force National Guard Adjutant General Senior Leader meeting in Washington, D.C. with senior defense officials, Mr. Speaker. And he briefed us in detail on a renewed and intensified role for the National Guard in providing for the national security of the nation. And the reason I stand before you today is to convey to you what is emerging on the national scene, because it will affect each of us in this chamber and down the hall as we provide for the needs of the Virginia National Guard. And so very briefly, Mr. Speaker, please permit me to update the House on where this is going.
As you well know, the Virginia National Guard is a ready, relevant force that provides not only for the combat needs of the nation to augment the active forces that watch over our shores, but to also provide for assistance during times of disaster relief here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our own Virginia National Guard is regarded as one of the finest in the nation. They have that sort of reputation, and we can take pride in that. Today, the Guard currently has 570 personnel on federal active duty missions who are conducting combat security and support operations in Southwest Asia and Cuba, and more than 700 additional personnel are expected to deploy overseas in calendar year 2016. Since September 11th, 2001, and the attacks on our country, more than 15,000 Virginia Guardsmen have deployed to overseas locations and have performed Homeland Security missions. Their role is going to take on a very significant increased footprint because, in the words of General Phil Breedlove, United States Air Force Commander of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, when he spoke in recent days to the Senate Armed Services Committee, refugees moving across the globe are masking a movement of terrorists and criminals, and ISIS is spreading like a cancer across the globe, end quote. And so with that, the Virginia National Guard is going to take on an increased role. They are presently growing new capabilities in the Commonwealth and expanding their facilities. For instance, the 192nd Fighter Wing is standing up a new cyber operations squadron at Langley Air Force Base in Hampton, and it was one of only 4 states that were selected to perform this critical national security mission. And the National Guard is also in the process of acquiring and expanding a facility in Botetourt County that was formerly the Botetourt Correctional Facility, and it will be used for a Force Readiness Center. So what we are seeing, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, is an increasing reliance of the nation on our National Guard and Reserve forces. Both General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and General Mark Welsh, the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, have clearly signaled their intention to leverage Guard capabilities in the out years. The most telling testimony came from Army Chief of Staff Mark Milley when he said, "Much of America's Army capacity is resident in the National Guard. I expect that demand will increase in the future, and we must rely more heavily on our National Guard to meet that demand. It's readily obvious to me that I need to employ more of the Guard, not less. And there is but one Army. We are not 10 active Army divisions. We are 18 Army divisions, active Guard and Reserve. We're not 32 brigades, we're 60 brigades, and we're not 490,000 soldiers, we're 980,000. Every time I hear the word 490,000, I jump through the ceiling. If I hear the words 10 divisions, I lose my mind. It's one Army, and we're not small. We're big, we're capable, and we're very capable because of the reserves, and we're capable because of the National Guard. In the out years, Mr. Speaker, we are going to need to focus on some things to build on the huge levels of support that this General Assembly has provided to our National Guard. They're looking for potentially more additional full-time personnel to help offset the reduction of 80 full-time federal Guardsmen, and that's a central element in their readiness mission. They need increasing support for Guard facility improvements and increased space at that newly acquired Botetourt Correctional Facility that's being converted to a Guard center. And they need assistance with enhanced anti-terrorism and force protection measures. And so, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I just wanted to update you on this new data point that came out at the General Assembly Military and Veterans Caucus yesterday. Our National Guard is ready, relevant, and ready, and they continue to need our support. In the words of General George Washington, based on his experience in the 18th century in that long war for American independence, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he very well knew that the most effectual means of preserving the peace is to be ready for war. And that's, in the end, our final obligation to support the Virginia National Guard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Stanton, Mr. Bell.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for an introduction.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in the House Gallery, we're joined by several young ladies from the Virginia Women's Institute for Leadership at Mary Baldwin College. VWIL is the nation's premier collegiate leadership program for college women. The Corps of Cadets is organized within a military structure, and this comprehensive program builds tomorrow's leaders for military and civilian service. VWIL is Virginia's most ethnically diverse student corps, and it combines academic integrity, physical training, leadership practice, and co-curricular activities. The students are joined today by General Terry Zurich, Commandant of the Cadet Corps. I'd ask you to please rise and please join me in giving them a warm House of Delegates welcome.
We're delighted to have the cadets with us today and hope you enjoy your time in the Capitol. The gentleman from Botetourt, Mr. Austin.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for an introduction.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, joining us today in the rear of the chamber is my friend, Reverend David Cox. Reverend Cox? Reverend Cox ministers to a relatively small congregation in the northern section of Botetourt County. He and his wife and families are pillars of that community, reaching out to many in need. Reverend Cox has also served on Botetourt County Parks and Recreation Board for many years. Where there, his concerns were always to improve opportunities for the youth. I'm pleased to have the privilege to serve with Reverend Cox on that board and to call him my friend. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the body give Reverend Cox and his wife a warm house welcome.
The other gentleman from Botetourt, Mr. Head.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we sit behind each other, it's hard to know who you're talking to there. Mr. Speaker, I rise for a brief point of personal privilege and an introduction.
You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, as most of you know, my wife and I own a home care company. We have 2 franchise offices of Home Instead Senior Care, and we're part of the home care and hospice industry in Virginia, doing what we can to change the face of aging in the Commonwealth by allowing people to age in place and face their twilight years on their own terms. Now, the home care and hospice industry in Virginia is a lot larger than you probably think. When you think about aging, it's very easy to look around and see the bricks and mortar of the hospital or the bricks and mortar of the facilities that are out there, the assisted livings and the nursing homes that are in our community. So you can see the impact that they have. But home care and hospice is largely invisible, but again, it's a lot bigger than you would think. According to a report by VCU, the home care and hospice industry has an annual economic impact in Virginia of over $1.1 billion and employs more people across the Commonwealth than insurance agencies and brokers, more people than pharmacies and drugstores, more people than credit unions, more people than the entire agricultural industry, more than manufacturing and machinery, more than the utilities, and more than elementary and secondary schools combined. It's a big deal. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce to you and recognize a group of my fellow Home Instead Senior Care franchisees who are with us in the gallery. And if they could please stand. Collectively, the 19 independently owned and operated offices of Home Instead employ nearly 2,500 caregiver employees, and they have an annual economic impact of over $50 million. They are here today to visit with members of the General Assembly and to begin to inform all of us about the industry and the impact of aging on Virginia. They're joined by Home Instead Incorporated's Vice President of Public Affairs, Phyllis Hegstrom, and so I hope the members will give them a warm house welcome.
We're very pleased to have the visitors from the home care industry with us today, and we thank you for all of your contributions to the Commonwealth. The gentleman from Albemarle, Mr. Bell.
Speaker, rise for a motion.
You may state it.
All right, Senate Bill 438, Senator Barker's bill. I'm going to make a motion to send that to courts. I'll tell everybody that I've spoken to the senator. He has no objection. There's a possible issue that would be only seen by courts people that did not get a full hearing in the Education Committee. It's not an effort to do damage to the bill, but we do want to review it.
The gentleman from Albemarle, Mr. Bell, moves that Senate Bill 438 be referred to the Committee on Courts. As many as favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That motion is agreed to. The gentleman from Culpeper, Mr. Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a request.
You may state it.
Request that HJR 409 on page 28 go by till Tuesday, March 8th.
HJR
409 on page 28.
409 go by till when?
Till Tuesday, March 8th.
Without objection, House Joint Resolution 409 by till March 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The gentleman from Giles, Mr. Yost.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for an introduction.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, joining us in the gallery today, every day law enforcement officers across the Commonwealth answer our calls and run toward unspeakable and unknown danger so that the rest of us are protected from it. Sometimes these brave men and women experience trauma from extraordinary critical incidents in the line of duty which they cannot shake, and they need special help. In the gallery, if I'll ask them if they please rise, are some law enforcement officers and citizens who volunteer their time to run a small but mighty statewide nonprofit known as the Virginia Law Enforcement Assistance Program. This program arranges support from peers and counseling from experts in an FBI-proven program to help Virginia law enforcement professionals in need. Since the program was born in the aftermath of the Virginia Tech shootings, over 300 officers from around the Commonwealth have participated in structured, effective 3-day retreats, and more than 100 fellow officers have volunteered for peer training so they can offer support on the spot when a crisis arises. These programs are doing wonders, bringing officers back to health and service, healing burnout, restoring these men and women to their best so they can serve their communities with excellence, support their departments, and anchor their families. Please join me in giving them a warm House welcome.
We thank you very much for your service to the Commonwealth, and we thank you for taking the time to come visit with us today. The gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for two motions.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I would move that the following bills and resolutions go by for the day on page 7 of the printed calendar: Senate Bill 669. On page 11, Senate Joint Resolution 88. On page 12, House Bill 259. That would conclude my motion with respect to those.
Without
respect to by for the
objection,
day.
those three pieces of legislation will be by for the day.
And finally, Mr. Speaker, I would move that on page 8 of the printed calendar, House Bill 773 go by until Monday, March 7th.
Without objection, House Bill 773 by until March, what was the date?
Monday, March 7th, Mr. Speaker.
7th. Thank you. Without objection. The gentleman from Suffolk, Mr. Jones.
Speaker, I rise for an announcement and a brief point of personal privilege.
Gentleman may proceed.
Speaker, in the audience, or the gallery, I should say, is members of Northampton Church of Christ. Some might ask why I'm announcing or introducing a group from Hampton. Why? That was my wife's home church. Her parents were charter members, and that is the church where we got married. And then if I ask them to stand, please, members from the Northampton Church of Christ, and give them a warm house welcome.
We're delighted to see the members from the church here today, and we thank you so much for taking the time.
And the real reason I had to introduce them is because my sister-in-law is in that group as well. A brief point of personal privilege. As you know, last week, the Speaker informally announced that the conferees for the budget, yesterday he formally took that action. I'm pleased to say that the Senate and House conferees have been meeting since last Friday. We've had very productive meetings this week. I think the Vice Chairman and the members of the Conference Committee would agree to that. It is our hope that we would be able to, as we did last year, have something on your desk the first part of next week. So I just wanted to keep the body informed as to our progress. And I thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, on the floor, we often contemplate legislation related to our schools. Many of us volunteer there or go there. We think about the people who are there. Some of you are former school board members, you're former teachers, administrators. I want us to think a little bit today about the legislation that we bring relating to our schools. They consume about 30% of our general fund, if my memory is correct, and we have one section of our Constitution which is devoted solely to this topic. We add to the lengthening list of prescriptions for our schools in the code every year. And that's the thing that I want you to think about. Because I want you to think today about the harried administrator, about the teacher that doesn't work a 40-hour week, but a lot more hours than that. Coaching, writing lesson plans into the evening, grading, and then returning to teach all day the next day, hoping to touch that mind, to touch that soul in a way that it hasn't been touched before, to connect them with a writer that you love, or with a fact about our civic reality that they haven't contemplated before that. Last year, I carried a bill along with a colleague down the hall, Senator Howell, related to teacher turnover. And there are a lot of reasons why teachers don't return to the classroom. It can be they're not a good fit. It can be that they get a better job offer. It can be that by common consent, they shouldn't continue in the classroom. That's fairly rare, but there are a lot of reasons why teachers leave, and I think it's well for us to think about that again. But I want us to think about education, and I want you to think about it in the off-season. This is kind of my thinking forwardly, and I hope that you will think forwardly. I want you to think about this. The people who work with kids every day, you think they think about class size? Do you think they think about the obesity of the kids around them? Do you think they worry about what facts ought to be considered as they present their lessons each day? They do. And you know what? They probably don't need us to regulate all of those things and probably dozens of others that need to be considered, that need to be part of the daily life of the schools. And I ask you to reflect on that. And I want you to think about the teacher who this afternoon is going to go down to the store, and she's going to pay out of her own, not princely salary, for materials that she'll bring back to that classroom. I want you to think about that teacher, maybe in his first year, who he comes into that classroom and he says, how am I going to fill this day? And then he gets home at night and he says, how am I going to fill tomorrow? What am I going to say new? How am I going to reach that kid that I haven't reached yet? That's thinking about everything else but what goes on in that classroom. And when you contemplate the next idea that can make Virginia's schools better, I want you to think about this quote from Oliver Cromwell. It's written in sort of Middle English, so you'll have to get a translation you can get on your computer. But what he said to some colleagues is, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ that you may be mistaken. You may not need to bring that piece of legislation that you think is so significant and so important. I ask you, and I know many of you do this already, you visit your schools. I ask you to ask them questions. Inquire what their experience is like. If your schedule allows you to do it, volunteer. You will be in for a treat to be in there in those classrooms. I've had the good fortune, as many of you know, to be in classrooms, to both see it from behind the podium as well as a policymaker on the State Board of Education. I want you to think about legislation. I want you to think about some good examples that people here across this body have done. And I'm just going to choose a few, and there are many of you who've already done this kind of thing. But I want you to think about the gentleman from Loudon. He brought a bill a couple of years ago that took SOL tests off the books. And we voted for that, happily, and it was the right thing. I want you to think about the gentlelady from Chesterfield. She brought us a bill to return the control of the calendar to schools. Let them decide what their calendar is. What a novel idea. I want you to think about the gentleman from Augusta who had a annual project of bringing bills here, bills to take something off the books. And he's done it in education as well as across the rest of the code of Virginia. I want you to think about that when you think about the schools and the people that you see in your schools. All of you, and some of you have described them here on the floor, can think of exemplary teachers, principals that set an example that is so admirable. I think in my district now, I've got 4 superintendents, and I tell you, please don't look them up. I don't want them to go to your district. I want them right in my district. We have got some outstanding superintendents in the district that I represent, and leave them alone. They're doing a fantastic job. I want you to think about those people, and I want you to think about them. Think about not encumbering them, but assisting them. Not needlessly regulating them, but enhancing what they do. I know every one of you admires and you want to fortify and ennoble those places that we call school. And I urge you to consider with care the practical effect of legislation that you'll bring next year that oversees our schools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen.
Are there further motions, resolutions under Rule 39? If not, the clerk will call the calendar.
Calendar for today, Thursday, March 3rd, 2016. First category, Senate bills on third reading uncontested calendar. 3 bills in the uncontested block. First up, page 1 of the printed calendar, Senate Bill 61, a bill to authorize the issuance of bonds in an amount up to $40,987,000 plus financing costs pursuant to Article 10, Section 9C of the Constitution of Virginia for paying costs of acquiring, constructing, and equipping revenue-producing capital projects at institutions of higher education of the Commonwealth. Emergency bills reported from the Committee on Appropriations.
The gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, Senate Bill 61 is simply the revenue bond bill related to the projects that our higher institutions of our higher learning institutions have for projects related to fees and the like that are paid for through those. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask that the House pass the bill.
Turning to page 2 of today's printed calendar, Senate Bill 625, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to transfers to the Port Opportunity Fund. The bill is reported from the Committee on Appropriations with a substitute.
The gentleman from Hanover, Mr. Peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the underlying Senate bill deals with the mechanism governing transfers to the Port Opportunity Fund. That bill provided that when the Port Authority's revenues exceeded their costs by at least 5%, the authority would transfer to the Port Opportunity Fund up to 5% of the revenues as long as that amount is greater than $2 million and unless the Secretary determined that the transfer is not in the long-term interest of the Port Authority or at least $2 million. The House Appropriations Committee substitute flips the existing code language and instead of transferring automatically, it states that the Secretary may request that the excess amounts be transferred to the fund. The second enactment also directs the Secretary and the Port Authority Board to evaluate whether the Port's anticipated capital and operating needs over the next 10 years support continuation of this fund with a report back. Bottom line, existing code language could result in Port revenues being transferred to marketing to the detriment of capital improvements and ongoing operations. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask that the committee substitute be adopted.
Questions on adoption of committee substitutes? Those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The substitute's agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask that the bill pass.
And the final bill in the block, Senate Bill 710, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to the composition of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority Compact of 1966. The bill no longer has an emergency clause. It was removed by the Senate. The bill was reported from the Committee on House Transportation.
The gentleman from Virginia Beach, Mr. Villanueva.
Mr. Speaker, Senate Bill 710 deals with appointing authority for the Board of Directors of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. The change for the WMATA Compact puts the change in the Code of Virginia to conform with federal law. I move that the bill pass.
Shall the bills pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 98, no 0.
Ayes 98, no 0. The bills are passed.
Continuing with today's calendar, page 2 of the printed version, next category of bills, Senate bills on third reading regular. First up, Senate Bill 407, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to on-site sewage systems. Report from the Committee on Health, Welfare, and Institutions.
The gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, under current law, any local government may enact an ordinance imposing civil sanctions for noncompliance with state-mandated, state-required maintenance requirements on alternative septic systems. Senate Bill 407 simply puts that same provision available to a local government for conventional septic systems. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, please understand the underlying public policy is that we need, no pun intended, is that we ensure that these systems don't fail because of the public health concerns that would cause. We've gone with the civil penalties on the alternative systems because it is a lighter club, a softer club, as it were, when an individual homeowner is not operating their system properly so that they would remediate the problem on these very costly systems before they failed. A local government still has, on an alternative system, criminal sanctions they can bring to bear if they choose, the situation is so serious that a civil penalty would not be appropriate. If we don't enact this legislation, then for a traditional or conventional septic system, the only stick that local government has to force compliance is a criminal sanction. This is purely permissive. The local government would have to go through an ordinance policy. The measure passed out of HWI 22-0, and I'd move adoption of the bill.
The gentleman from Rockbridge, Mr. Klein.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, isn't it true that the burden of proof for a locality to prove a violation for a civil penalty is lower than the burden of proof for approving a criminal penalty?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond the gentleman is exactly correct, but that is frankly not the issue that local government and the folks with the health department are trying to get at. It is rather the remediation of the system and proper maintenance before any civil or criminal sanction might attach. It is normal practice in my discussion with folks in legislative services that when the civil or criminal sanction is cited to the individual, they are given a time certain in which to remediate the problem, and if that's remediated, then the charge is dismissed.
I thank the gentleman.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 67, noes 31.
Ayes 67, noes 31. The bill is passed.
Continuing with the calendar, Senate Bill 224, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to public schools, tobacco products. Report of the Committee on Education. And Mr. Speaker, there are also are floor amendments.
The gentleman, Prince William, Mr. Lingenfelder.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, there are amendments to this bill that are floor amendments, but I'll go ahead and address the bill now and then address the floor amendments. Is that your process?
Clerk will report.
Floor amendments offered to the engrossed version by Delegate Lingenfelder. There are three. Amendment number 1, at the beginning of line 13, insert the letter A, capital A, for a new category. Amendment 2 Amendment 2 on line 15, after the word activity, insert on publicly owned property. And amendment number 3 on line 15, at the end, insert capital B for a new category that reads, notwithstanding the provisions of subsection A school board may permit the use of tobacco products or nicotine vapor products, as those terms are defined in section 18.2-371.2, within a designated area of high school property that is outside of any school building.
The gentleman, Prince William.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by way of explaining the amendments, let me share with the House the underlying bill that Senator Miller brought. because we did not have a companion of such here in the House. But this bill essentially deals with smoking on school grounds. Under current law, Virginia schools are required to prohibit tobacco use on school property, but property is defined as only the interior of the buildings and not in the school buses and vehicles, not the school grounds. Or I should say, property is defined as only the interior of buildings and in school buses and vehicles, but not the grounds that surround the school. Some 20 school divisions in Virginia, most of whom are in Southwest, have adopted the tobacco-free policy in many of those districts, and the bill that Senator Miller brings us would expand that. A couple of years ago, the House will remember that we prohibited the use of e-cigarettes, the vapes, on school grounds, in buildings and buses, and or at school-sponsored activities. So while we banned the e-cigarettes throughout the campus, we do not ban the tobacco use. Again, tobacco use is only currently banned in the buildings and the buses and vehicles. Now, when the bill came to the House Education Committee, I voted against it, and I voted against it for two reasons. When you talk about school-sponsored activities, you're talking about things like proms, you're talking about things like bonfires or other related activities that could be conducted on private property. And as this bill is written, it extends to private property, so I have an issue with that. So one of your amendments, the second amendment that we have here, makes clear that it's only on school property. The second issue that I have is, I don't smoke cigarettes. Some people do, and that's fine with me if they so choose. But when you a priori just ban them from any school activity, imagine one fall weekend, you happen to be a smoker and you go to a high school football game. This bill, as it was brought to us, would basically say you can't even smoke during the halftime. You can't come out of the stands and go to a designated area and have a cigarette if you so desire. I thought that was wrong. And so the third amendment that is here basically gives the schools the authority to create a designated smoking area on the school property so that people who, of their own volition, if they want to smoke a cigarette or a cigar or pipe or whatever, or vape, they can go to that area and do so. Now, again, I voted against this bill in committee, but I have told the senator that if he would accept these amendments, that I would support his bill. Each person has to make up their own mind with respect to the amended bill. But I'm going to keep my word to him, and I'm going to support this bill if you accept these amendments. And so, Mr. Speaker, those are the amendments, and I would move the amendments.
The gentleman from Charlottesville, Mr. Toscano, speaking to the amendments.
Will the gentleman yield for a question about the amendments?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the gentleman, I'm not sure, is he saying that the senator accepts the amendments, or is he simply saying that he will vote for the bill if we accept the amendments?
Mr. Speaker, I'm saying both, that I will vote for the bill if the amendments are accepted, and I'm saying that the senator is in agreement with these amendments.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman from Fairfax, Ms. Watts, speaking to the amendments.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I would like to request that the amendments be severed and that we vote on Amendment 2 separate from Amendments 1 and 3.
Okay.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Fauquier, Mr. Weber.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman from Prince William yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
I yield.
About the amendments? For amendment number 2 that adds on public-owned property, would that extend to like your community parks or other facilities that are owned by the localities?
I would say to the gentleman that it was my understanding in the context of this bill, this would be school grounds. But if in the interpretation of the gentleman or others that it does extend to other public property, say owned by a municipality, that's not the intent here. It's not the intent to extend to the local DMV parking lot or that sort of thing. But if the gentleman believes that there needs to be sufficient clarity to that, then I'm happy to take the bill by, go back to the sponsor of the bill, and ask him if he would further like us to narrow the scope to the school property.
I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Lemunion, speaking to the amendments.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Actually, a question. I wonder if the clerk could just restate or summarize the three amendments again now that they're severed so we know which ones are which. I don't have that on my screen.
We're going to vote on amendment. I'll ask them to do amendments 1 and 3 first and then amendment 2. That's how they'll be severed. Clerk will re-report the amendments.
Thank you.
Re-reporting amendments 1 and 3, amendment A, inserts A to pick up the next bit that we'll put on 2, but the 1 and 3 would be on line 15, insert B. Notwithstanding the provisions of subsection A, a school board may permit the use of tobacco products or nicotine vapor products, as those terms are defined in section 18.2-371.2 of the code, within a designated area of high school property that is outside of any school building.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Farrell.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman from Prince William yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, do school boards already have the authority to do this on their own volition now if they so chose to do it?
Mr. Speaker, I would say, as I noted in my remarks when I was presenting the bill, that there are several schools in Southwest Virginia who do this now.
Mr. Speaker, follow-up question.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Farrell.
I yield.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for a further question?
The gentleman yield. Gentleman yields.
In the spirit of the gentleman from Powhatan's earlier remarks, I was wondering for a little more context why the gentleman feels that we should be dictating it when many of these elected officials who answer to the voters themselves, shouldn't we trust the voters to make the judgments on the decisions they're making for local issues?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to the gentleman by saying I think that is a remarkably well-crafted question for the patron of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is on the adoption of the floor amendments offered by the gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Lingenfelter. We're going to vote on floor amendment 1 and 3. Shall floor amendments 1 and 3 be agreed to?
Mr. Speaker,
The gentleman from Charlottesville, Mr.
I
Toscano.
rise for a request.
Gentleman has floor.
I think in light of some of these questions, I request this bill go by for the day so that the patron could be consulted and make sure we clear up this issue about publicly owned property, because I think it is unclear right now.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Prince William.
Mr. Speaker, if we were to act on amendments 1 and 2, and obviously the bill would be amended at that point, would it not be appropriate at that time to then entertain a motion to take it by for the day?
Well, if we're going to vote on them separately, let's do it all at once. So,
thank you,
without
Mr.
objection, Senate Bill 224 by for the day.
Continuing on page 3 of the printed calendar, Senate bills on third reading regular. Next up, Senate Bill 458, a bill to direct the Board of Education to establish guidelines for alternatives to suspension. The bill is reported to the Committee on Education.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Bagby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senate Bill 458 is not, I repeat, is not similar to my House Bill 1061. This bill simply directs the Board of Education to establish guidelines for alternatives to short-term and long-term suspension. I move adoption of this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Rock.
Will the gentleman yield for purposes of a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, my question would be, can he cite any school division in the Commonwealth who does not have already in place in their school board adopted code of conduct alternatives to short and long-term expulsion and a specific disciplinary track, shall we say, for first offense, second offense, things of that nature. My point being, can he cite any school division who on their own volition hasn't already put in place what we're now, if we pass this, telling the Department of Education, you've got to do statewide as a guideline when the local school division's already been doing it?
Mr. Speaker, I cannot, and I don't believe there are any. What this bill, I believe, intends to do, as we did in Henrico, we did a full revamp of our student code of conduct. If we had this tool available, it would have made it a lot easier for us to craft that plan, and it also makes it easier for individuals moving from locality to locality to have some consistency. And so that's what I believe this bill will offer, consistency.
I thank the gentleman speaking to the matter at the proper time.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the point of my question was every school division already has alternatives in place. I would also suggest to the body that to take this authority away from the school divisions, whether you're taking away the local citizen input to address alternatives as they see best, and to force the Department of Education to do something that still comes back to the local school divisions to either adopt or not adopt guidelines, would frankly be an exercise in futility on the part of the Department of Education, Board of Education, and I would suggest the body vote red on this matter.
The gentlewoman from Richmond City, Ms. McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
Gentlewoman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, this bill does not mandate that local school divisions do anything. What it does is ask the Board of Education to come up with guidelines for some alternatives that those local boards can consider using. What this basically would do is share best practices among localities. For example, Henrico County and the city of Richmond, in response to the large numbers of students who have been expelled or suspended, has put in place some pretty innovative and creative solutions for dealing with that. And those type of programs could then become part of guidelines that other schools can look at to decide this might be a creative idea that we want to do for ourselves, but it just gives them sort of a one-stop shop to see what are other alternatives that other school divisions are using that we might decide that we want to use ourselves. So I ask that you vote for pass the bill.
Gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentlelady from Richmond rise for a question?
Will the gentlewoman yield?
I yield.
Gentlewoman yields.
Again, a similar theme here, but I would ask the gentlelady, would she describe the authority that school boards have now to change and alter their own policies as pretty broad, or is it pretty restricted now currently from the state?
I think there are some guidelines in current code that would guide the localities, but that is not what this bill is about. What this bill is about is trying to put together in one place best practices or alternative programs or alternative options that one school division may be using, that several school divisions may be using, that others haven't looked at, just to say if a local school division wants some creative opportunities to deal with discipline issues in their schools, they can look to the Board of Education rather than having to look across the state to figure out, well, what is each individual jurisdiction doing?
Mr. Speaker, follow-up question.
Will the gentlewoman yield?
I yield.
Gentlewoman yields.
So as the title of the bill states, are guidelines truly guidelines and not mandatory to be followed?
Guidelines, Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman, guidelines are guidelines. Guidelines are not mandates.
Mr. Speaker, just one quick follow-up, because I didn't really get it.
Will the gentlewoman yield?
So these are not mandatory in any way, shape, or form? Nobody has to
Gentlewoman
actually...
yields.
Yes, I yield.
So they're not mandatory in any way?
Mr. Speaker, I would answer these guidelines are not mandatory in any way.
The gentleman from Salem, Mr. Habib.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask the body to vote against this bill for some of the same reasons why we spoke against and then referred back Delegate Bagby as well as Delegate LaRock's bills early in the session. Let me tell you the practical effect of what's going to happen when this comes into play. So guidelines might not be mandatory, but when you expel kids from school, they hire lawyers, and their lawyers fight the expulsion. There are all kinds of current basis for that now. And what's going to happen is we are announcing what the public policy should be, which are alternatives to expulsion, alternatives to suspension. We're directing the board to develop guidelines, and every school that doesn't do that and then tries to take action against a kid and get sued, the basis for that is going to be a due process violation that they're not following the practices that should be followed. So I agree with delegate from Richmond who said this is not exactly like his bill. It's frankly, it's less bad than his bill, but it's still bad, and I would ask the body to defeat it.
The gentleman from Henrico, Mr. Bagby.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill, I don't know if that was a compliment or not, but I will accept it as such. Again, as the gentleman lady from Richmond said, this bill is not a mandate. As I mentioned, a number of localities, and I can speak from experience from Henrico School Board, what we tried to do was to revamp our guidelines and our code of conduct and bring it up to date. One of the challenges that we had as a locality is trying to get some ideas of alternatives, and what we ended up doing as localities, and somewhere like Henrico can afford to do it, but some of these smaller localities may not be afforded the same opportunity to go visit a school in Northern Virginia or a school in Hampton Roads to find out some best practices. This is just another tool for localities to use related to crafting their code of conduct.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 43, noes 55.
Ayes 43, noes 55. The bill fails to pass.
Senate Bill 438 has been referred to the Committee on Courts. Turning to page 4 of today's printed calendar, continuing Senate bills on third reading regular. Senate Bill 776, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the code relating to determining residency of public school students. Report from the Committee on Education.
The gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, Senate Bill 776 deals with residency of children in kinship care. This legislation, even though there is set out in the bill, if you look at it, deals with kinship care and allows what children receiving kinship care can do within school divisions related to residency or the families. But what this is all about, basically, if you look at line 14 is dealing with the timing of the issue when we dealt with this issue before. And apparently there was a technical difficulty related to the date when this would take effect. And this legislation simply making sure that we can do it in the time frame that was originally anticipated. So, Mr. Speaker, I would move that the bill pass.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 98, no 0.
Ayes 98, no 0. The bill is passed.
Senate Bill 179, a bill to amend and reenact two sections of the Code of Virginia relating to the Small Business Investment Grant Fund administration qualifications. Bills reported to the Committee on General Laws on the 23rd and also reported to the Committee on Appropriations on the 29th of February.
The gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, this bill changes the administration of Small Business Investment Grant Fund from the Department of Small Business and Supplier Diversity to the Virginia Small Business Financing Authority, and it also makes changes to the eligibility of businesses to receive grants from that fund, and I would move the bill pass.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 95, noes 2.
Ayes 95, noes 2. The bill is passed.
Turn to page 5 of the printed calendar, Senate Bill 246, a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to grants for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics competition teams at qualified schools. Report from the Committee on Education with amendments on February 24th. Subsequently reported from the Committee on Appropriations with an amendment, on March 1st, and they are not in conflict.
The gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Mr. Speaker, first I'd like to move the committee amendments from the Committee on Education.
Questions on adoption of the Committee on Education amendments? May favor that motion will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The amendments are agreed to. Gentleman from Augusta.
Mr. Speaker, now I'd like to move the amendment from the Committee on Appropriations.
The questions on adoption of the amendment from the Committee on Appropriations? Many in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Augusta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the House, Senate Bill 246 would set up basically, which would now with the Appropriations Committee amendment be a pilot program related to trying to provide competitive teams or grants to competitive teams for school systems basically in the more rural areas of the Commonwealth to try to encourage these competition teams. The Committee on Education provided some clarification that when we talk about STEM, we talk about computer science, computational thinking, and computer coding. Again, the vision for this grant program would be these competition teams are related to robotics or the like. The amendment from appropriations basically set this out for 2 years to try this. There is money in the budget from the standpoint of the Senate budget, and we're considering that on the House side as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I would move the passage of the bill.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Albo.
Speaker, the gentleman yield for a question.
Will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Speaker, I would be glad to yield.
Gentleman, glad to yield.
Mr. Speaker, so every year I go to appropriations and I have a new fund, I get the speech. We don't create new funds. So why is this one so special, other than my bills maybe being dumb?
Mr. Speaker, I would say to the gentleman, and then I can yield to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, we like this one better.
Right. Thank you, Mr.
The questions on adoption of the, we've adopted the amendments, haven't we? Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 95, noes 2.
Ayes 95, noes 2. The bill is passed.
Turn to page 6, today's printed calendar. Next up, Senate Bill 360, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the code relating to the Superintendent of Public Instruction tracking teacher turnover. The bill was reported to the House Committee on Education with an amendment on February 22nd, reported to the House Committee on Appropriations on March 1st.
The gentleman from Loudoun, Mr. Greason.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the amendment.
Those on adoption of the committee amendment, as many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Loudoun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this morning, the gentleman from Powhatan talked about some work that was done over the course of the past year to look at the teachers in our classrooms and ultimately what's happening with them. This bill is actually a result of that work done over the off-season. And if you look at the language, the bill originally said that the Superintendent of Public Instruction shall develop and implement a system to track teacher turnover, which may include exit questionnaires, annual reporting, and a whole bunch of other stuff. That was going to cost a lot of money. So the patron wisely adjusted this to say that the superintendent shall develop and provide a local school division a model exit questionnaire for teachers, an exit interview. We do this in business all the time. We do this in other areas of the Commonwealth. I heard a comment earlier that localities can already do this, but the problem is when you have a different questionnaire in every locality around the Commonwealth, you can't start to identify trends and see commonalities of why teachers may or may not be leaving. So having a standard questionnaire is a good idea, and I ask that the bill pass.
Shall the bill pass? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 94, noes 4.
Ayes 94, noes 4. The bill is passed.
Senate Bill 440, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to the Virginia Guaranteed Assistance Program, eligibility, use of funds. Bill is reported to the Committee on Appropriations with a substitute.
The gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I move adoption of the committee substitute.
Questions on adoption of the committee substitute? As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Substitute is agreed to. The gentleman from Colonial Heights.
Mr. Speaker, with the adoption of the substitute, SB 440 deals with the VGAP program, the Virginia Guaranteed Assistance Program. It's been conformed to my earlier bill. What it does is basically two things. It incentivizes students to try to get them from their freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, gives them progressively more financial aid. One of the arguments against that in years past is we have not put enough money in the budget for financial aid. This year we put $24.1 million in the first year and $28.6 million in the second year, which is $4.5 million above the governor. So we tried to sort of fit that criticism that a lot of people had made. The second thing it does is you get 4 years of financial aid under the VGAP program currently, but this basically says to qualify, you must be a true freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. That's 30 hours. Currently, it is 12 each semester. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I hope it would be the pleasure of the House to pass the bill.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 95, noes 2.
Ayes 95, noes 2. The bill is passed.
Turning to page 7 of the printed calendar, Senate Bill 515, a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to mobile food vending in commuter lots in Planning District 8, fees, security. The bill is reported to the Committee on Transportation with amendments.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Lingenfelder.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I move the committee amendments.
Questions on adoption of the committee amendments? May favor that motion will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Motion is agreed to. Gentleman from Prince William.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the patron of this bill is seeking to allow food trucks with valid permits from the Department of Health to apply for a permit with VDOT to sell food in commuter lots in Planning District 8 in Northern Virginia. So it's limited to Planning District 8. This would provide convenience to commuters and promote folks who have these sorts of businesses. VDOT has the flexibility to manage the program. They'll establish a criteria and a fee, determine the number of vendors per lot, and determine the location of the food trucks within the lot. The amendments, as I read them, basically clarify that when a food truck is there in the parking lot, they are not there in the capacity of a commuter parking in that lot. So that's what I think your amendments do. I move we pass the bill.
Gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Mr. Speaker, would my seatmate, the gentleman from Prince William, yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the gentleman, I read this bill very quickly, but cannot now localities regulate where food trucks are or are not? And why is this bill necessary vis-a-vis what I think most localities do, and that is have the regulation of where food trucks can be based on what the locality determines?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to the gentleman in my limited knowledge about local planning to simply say that I believe this bill is necessary because VDOT actually owns these parking lots. A locality does not.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Speaker.
Shall the bill pass? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 91, noes 6.
Ayes 91, noes 6. The bill is passed.
And Senate Bill 669 has been taken by for the day. Accordingly, turning to the next category of bills, today's calendar, House bills with Senate amendments. House bills with Senate amendments, page 8 of the printed calendar. House Bill 773 has been taken by until Monday, March 7th. Accordingly, first up, House Bill 66, a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to the establishment of the New Economy Workforce Credential Grant Program. The bill passed the House on February 15th, passed the Senate with amendments on March 1st.
The gentlewoman from Bedford, Ms. Byron, whatever.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendments from the Senate basically are clarifying amendments that the training will be for actually non-credit workforce training for those that are not just certificates of completion, and it also clarifies these institutions that are authorized to do that training. It would be the pleasure of the House to accept the amendments.
Shall the Senate amendments be agreed to? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 96, noes 2.
Ayes 96, noes 2. The Senate amendments are agreed to.
Turn to page 9 of the printed calendar, House Bill 136, a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to damaged stationary duck blinds in the city of Virginia Beach, civil penalty. The bill passed the House February 1st, passed the Senate with amendments on March 1st.
The gentleman from Virginia Beach, Mr. Knight.
Mr. Speaker, House Bill 136 takes out duplicative language and only allows for a single penalty, and I move the House accept the Senate amendments.
Shall Senate amendments be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 96, noes 0.
Ayes 96, noes 0. The Senate amendments are agreed to.
House Bill 448, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the Code of Virginia relating to the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Nutrient Credit Exchange Program. The bill passed the House February 15th, passed the Senate with an amendment on March 1st.
The gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Senate amendment adds Virginia. We have the Chesapeake Bay TMDL Watershed Implementation Plan. It should have been the Virginia Chesapeake Bay TMDL Watershed Implementation Plan, a crucial amendment to my bill, so I hope it will be the pleasure of the House to accept the Senate amendment.
Shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 96, noes 0.
Ayes 96, noes 0. The Senate amendment is agreed to.
House Bill 516, House Bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to the Board of Education policy on sexually explicit instructional material. The bill passed the House February 4th, passed the Senate with an amendment on March 1st.
The gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask the House to agree to the Senate amendment. It basically just clarifies that the Board of Education at the state level would be responsible for the definition, not a local school board. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the House to agree to the Senate amendment.
The gentleman from Arlington, Mr. Lopez.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Speaker. This amendment really speaks to the unintended consequences of this bill. Under this amendment, the State Board of Election would have to define sexually explicit. Governments have been having a hard time defining that for a very long time. Where do you draw the line? For example, the FTC defined sexually explicit so broadly in 2009 in a report to Congress that it included a mere reference to sexual activity. Are we talking about holding hands, kissing? Is Romeo and Juliet about to be diminished and reduced to a play about teen sex and suicide? As opposed to being a local school division decision. According to the American Library Association, the bill would make Virginia the first state to create a statewide policy requiring teachers to identify classroom materials with sexually explicit content and notify parents who would have the right to opt out their children and request that the teacher give them something less objectionable to study of equivalent value. It would require teachers to redefine whatever they're teaching solely in terms of how much sexually explicit content it may contain. More than likely, a teacher will not be able to do 2 entire lesson plans for the same class, sometimes on very quick turnaround, after an objection from just one parent. This makes it much less likely that they'd be willing to even attempt to use anything that might be considered objectionable in their lessons. As Delegate Ware so eloquently stated just a second ago, let's not encumber or needlessly regulate our teachers. Without intending to do it, this will be have a dampening effect to avoid any content that might be found objectionable. Here's the thing. When the government establishes laws to label literature in terms of a single factor, regardless of that factor's significance to the larger world of literary merit or meaning, it edges closer to censorship. It means we are labeling content for the sole purpose of potentially suppressing it. Parents do, of course, have the right and even the obligation to supervise their children's education, but this bill and this amendment are about would affect everybody's children. Also, this bill is broadly written to include all educational materials, history, science, biology, art history, not just English and literature. Are we talking about notifying parents about the sexual references in biology courses? What about art history textbooks? Would a trip to the art museum require a warning to parents about paintings and sculpture? Are we saying that history and civics classes would not be allowed to discuss war crimes involving rape? Yesterday, we passed a resolution making 2016 the year of...
Gentleman Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I've heard all the gentleman's points so far. I think he was about to make another. I'm wondering if the gentleman could tell us why he didn't make these points when he voted for the bill initially.
Mr. Speaker, I would say that as we read bills and as we learn about life and learn about issues, we can all make mistakes like I think we all did when we first voted for this bill unanimously.
Gentleman may continue.
Yesterday, exactly right. Here's another one. Yesterday, we passed a resolution making this 2016 the year of Shakespeare. In college, I played Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1. Thank you. I was typecast. Well, it's one of Shakespeare's great history plays, much of which takes place in a brothel. There are almost no Shakespeare plays that don't have some prurient or salacious content. For a junior taking an AP English class and learning iambic pentameter, what is a less objectionable literary work that is the equivalent to any of Shakespeare's plays? What is the equivalent to Toni Morrison's Beloved or Blue Eyes? How about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness? Or the new Grammy Award-winning Broadway musical Hamilton that deals honestly with Hamilton's adulterous affairs? Does it not matter that folks who originally pushed this bill are raising objections to Pulitzer Prize-winning novels or the works of Nobel laureates? English classes, particularly in the last 2 years of high school, often deal with adult topics. Do these mature minors need protection from language and situations they have seen on the internet or in the media?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, is the gentleman aware that during the debate on this bill in the Senate, that a member of the Senate began to read from one of the works of a Nobel laureate, and everyone was so incensed that he would dare to read from that work in front of the Senate pages that they asked him to cease immediately reading from that great work from that Nobel laureate? Is the gentleman aware of that?
Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman that yes, I am. I would also answer the gentleman that taking a piece of literature out of context from an overall narrative is ludicrous. It does a disservice to literature, academia, and it should do a disservice to this body.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for another question?
Gentleman yield.
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, does the gentleman not believe that parents should have similar rights to assert what is in the best interest of the hearing of their children, as did those standing basically in their shoes, supervising them in the Senate the other day? Does he not believe parents should have a similar right to shield their children from things that are quite obviously objectionable and inappropriate for their age?
Mr. Speaker, I'd answer the gentleman that at the same time, does he believe that state government needs to be involved in a discussion that could and should be simply resolved by parents at home? And is it really necessary that we have a state law forcing this when in fact localities can do this already on their own?
Mr. Speaker, over here, parliamentary inquiry.
Somebody state it.
The gentleman from Arlington or Alexandria did not ask the gentleman from Shenandoah to yield for a question. He asked the gentleman from Shenandoah a question. I don't think he asked that gentleman to yield. Is that a proper form?
Mr. Speaker, I would correct Mr. Speaker.
Pardon?
Sorry.
It's okay. Gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd correct the record that I am from Arlington and Fairfax, not from Alexandria. Here's the thing. Let's be clear. The requirement that educators identify, label, and stigmatize literature to a single, undefined standard is a form of censorship that is meant to suppress the teaching of certain texts without regard to their literary merit. This should not be the role of government, nor should the state supersede local policies that already address this issue. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, this is a slippery slope to backdoor censorship. I hope that we will reject this amendment and send the legislation back to conference for much more needed.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Albo.
Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Speaker, this is not usually a topic that I get involved in on the House floor, but this arose from a constituent of mine whose daughter came home and when she was doing her homework in her room, started crying and ran out and showed her mother this book written by Toni Morrison. I can't remember what the title of the book was. And we all know Toni Morrison is a treasure of America. She's a wonderful author. But she didn't write this book for kids to read. And so then my constituent read the thing to me. I lived in a fraternity house for 2 years. There's not very much stuff that bothers me. And even I was aghast at how bad it was. And then the gentleman from Fairfax reminded me that she then sent the material to the State Board of Education to complain about it. And the State Board of Education's website refused to accept the email because the pornography screens had canceled it out. I would agree with the gentleman from Arlington who made a very good presentation, and I understand his point, but I don't agree with it. His point, which I would agree, says that the purpose of this bill is to label material. That's correct. What he then said was for the purpose of suppression, and I don't agree with that. I think it is labeling the material for the purpose of notifying the parents so that they can make a decision on what's appropriate for their children to read. Thank you.
The gentleman from Augusta, Mr. Landis.
Mr. Speaker, addressing the amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
And that's what we have before us, ladies and gentlemen, is the amendment. The amendment is to allow the Board of Education to define sexually explicit material. The Board of Education and the department are the professionals that deal with our education policy, and that's what we determined in this bill should be the body that works on this issue. As the gentleman from Fairfax, Delegate Albo, said, this bill does three things. One, it lets parents know when there's sexually explicit material. Two, it allows them, working with the teacher, to determine if that's appropriate for their child. And three, if they think that it's not appropriate for their young person, then they can ask for an alternative assignment. There's no book banning, there's no censorship, there's none of those things in this bill. And it's been misrepresented by many people that that's what this does. That is not what this bill does, and I hope you'll agree to the amendment.
The gentlewoman from Fairfax, Ms. Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
The amendment is at the heart of my concern. I have enjoyed the richness of the tapestry of Virginia, and I know how different we are from one corner to another. And when I look at the amendment that is going to set one standard for the communities throughout Virginia, that is what causes me problems. Each community should be able to decide. I am not talking about the procedures that the patron just outlined. I am talking about this amendment, which is setting one standard for each of our communities, and I hope you will vote against the amendment.
The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman from Augusta rise for a question?
Gentleman yield.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to yield about the amendment that is before us.
Yep.
The gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, that's what I'd like to ask him about, the amendment. I just wanted to ask the gentleman, would it be a legitimate reason to vote no that you based your decision on the philosophy laid out by the gentleman from Powhatan, which was so timely this morning on the for this day's calendar, and And it consistent with what the gentlelady from Fairfax just said, that we might want to just leave this issue to the localities. Would that be a legitimate reason to vote no?
Mr. Speaker, I'd answer the gentleman that, one, back in 1987, this body determined that with family life education, that was an important enough an issue that we set a standard as a policy across the Commonwealth related to parental involvement with family life education. I'd also point out, too, that this issue came about because a local school board did not act on the issue related to the parents' concern, and two, the Board of Education is trying to address this, and this tries to codify what they're already working on related to guidelines because it is a sensitive issue and because there are issues time and time raised about how to define and what materials should be included or not be included, and that is what the Board of Education is much better to determine. If we have inconsistent policies related to this, as we did with family life education, what I believe will occur is you'll have one school having one policy, another school having another policy, and the problem will be from the standpoint of parents that are in adjoining jurisdictions or moving from one locality to another. And as we did with family life education, we determined there needed to be a consistent policy. And again, would remind the gentleman, the only reason we have this bill is because the department has not implemented what was determined that they needed to when you look at school boards. I'd also mentioned to the gentleman that most school boards want the Board of Education to be the one that defines this, not trying to come up with 130 some odd definitions of what sexually explicit material may be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speak to the bill briefly at the appropriate time.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman's response, and there were some good answers in there. But as someone who came down here to support my local government and allow them to do what they need to do and have school boards be responsible for their jurisdiction, this happened in my jurisdiction. We've had school board elections since this incident occurred. The results are out there. The school board can handle it. They can filter the elections that they've had and decide how they want to move forward on this issue. So I would encourage the body to vote no. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Rock.
Mr. Speaker, I move the pending question.
Gentleman from Carolina, Mr. Rock, moves the pending question. Those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Pending question is called for. Shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 76, noes 21.
Ayes 76, noes 21. The Senate amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, continuing with today's calendar, page 10 of the printed version, House bills with Senate amendments, House Bill 1094, a bill to amend and reenact various sections of the Code of Virginia, repeal a number of others, all relating to commodity boards. The bill passed the House February 8th, passed the Senate with an amendment on March 1st.
The gentleman from Fauquier, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the body agree to the Senate amendment. The Senate amendment basically clarifies that the 2000 referendum is the reason for the cotton increase in cotton assessment.
Shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 97, noes 0.
Ayes 97, noes 0. The Senate amendment is agreed to.
House Bill 1127, a bill to amend and reenact several sections of the Code of Virginia and repeal a section of a chapter of the Acts of Assembly of 1956 relating to forest fire protection compacts, passed the House February 1st, passed the Senate with amendments on March 1st.
Gentleman from Salem, Mr. Habib.
Mr. Speaker, HB 1127 codified the Forest Fire Protection Compact. Senate figured out that we had left out a fairly insignificant and inconsequential state, so the amendment just adds another state. So accept it.
Shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 98, no 0.
Ayes 98, no 0. Senate amendment is agreed to.
House Bill 1231, a bill to amend and reenact one section of the Code of Virginia relating to dogs chasing livestock. Passed the House February 15th, passed the Senate with amendments on March 1st.
The gentleman from Frederick, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, my favorite bill comes back. On this bill, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to accept the amendment. We originally struck out killed, but we need to put it back in because not all game wardens euthanize dogs. They actually kill them. So that was a request from the patron. Thank you.
Shall the Senate amendment be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 86, noes 11.
Ayes 86, noes 11. The Senate amendment is agreed to.
Continuing with the calendar, next category, resolutions, regular calendar. Page 11 of the printed version. First up, Senate Joint Resolution 63, requesting the Department of Social Services to study child day programs exempt from licensure. Report from the Committee on Rules with a substitute. Mr. Speaker, that committee substitute was agreed to yesterday.
The gentleman from Carolina, Mr. O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, ladies of the House, this measure was explained yesterday to some length. The long and the short, we have not looked at the current 15 categories of exemptions since they were put into code over 20 years ago. This will simply have DSS looking at those. There will be no changes in the current exemptions unless we, as a matter of public policy, change the current law to either expand or restrict the current 15 exemptions. Hope it the pleasure of the body to pass the resolution.
Gentleman from Spotsylvania, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the resolution.
Gentleman has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I hope that we would defeat this resolution. I have a few problems with it. One, I've never seen a government study that didn't come back justifying more government. And two, I have concerns about the agency that's responsible for licensing and regulating these bodies as being the one in charge of basically conducting the study to whether or not they should be exempt. It should be, I think, an impartial body like JLARC conducting the study and not the Department of Social Services. I fully expect Social Services to be an advocate for more licensure and not less, and I hope we will defeat the resolution.
The gentleman from Norfolk, Ms. Hester.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
The gentleman has the floor.
I do hope that we will support this legislation. It's been 20 years, as you've heard, since we've looked at the exemptions. There are 14 of them. Some of them probably don't need to be in, some still need to be in, but it's really, even with the concerns, the recommendations are coming back to this body before any other decisions are made, and that will give us a chance to determine whether or not it should go to JLARC to be looked at even further. But at this point, we're just looking at the exemptions to see and if there are any recommendations that would be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shall the resolution be agreed to? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 70, noes 28.
Ayes 70, noes 28. The resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a motion.
Gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, having voted on the prevailing side by which we by which we accepted the Senate amendments to House Bill 516, I would ask that we reconsider that vote. Speaking to the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, this is the bill we just debated at some length, the amendments we just debated at some length. And I believe someone wanted to correct their vote in proper form, and I just want to make sure everybody else was paying attention to
Senate Bill 515. 516
on page 9.
HB 516.
I would move that we reconsider that.
The gentleman from Shenandoah moves that having voted on the prevailing side by which we agreed to the Senate amendments on House Bill 516, we reconsider that vote. As many as favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That amendment is agreed to. Shall the Senate...
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman shall...
Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman may state it.
Just so everyone understands, am I correct that we are voting on the Senate amendment to this bill? So if you voted for the Senate amendment, you vote for it. If you voted against it before and you don't want to change your vote, you vote against it, right? Yeah.
That's why he gets paid the extra bucks. Shall the Senate amendments be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 77, noes 21.
Ayes 77, noes 21. The Senate amendments are agreed to.
Returning to page 11 of the printed calendar, Senate Joint Resolution 88 has been taken by for the day. Next category, House Bill vetoed by the governor. House Bill 259 has been taken by for the day. Accordingly, that completes today's calendar.
Does the clerk have any announcements or communications? The House will come to order. Clerk will report a resolution.
House Joint Resolution number 424 offered by Delegate Lupasi. House Joint Resolution 424 offered by Delegate Lupasi. Election of a Supreme Court of Virginia Justice. Resolved by the House of Delegates, the Senate concurring, that the General Assembly shall proceed this day to the election of a Supreme Court of Virginia Justice for a term of 12 years commencing March 3rd, 2016, and that in the execution of the joint order, a nomination shall be made and that each House shall be notified of said nomination, and when the roll shall be called for the whole number, the presiding officers of each House shall appoint a committee of 3, which together shall constitute the joint committee to count the vote of each House and report the results to their respective Houses. The joint order may be suspended by the presiding officer of either House at any time, but for no longer than 24 hours to receive the report of the joint committee. The copy of this resolution will be available momentarily.
The gentleman from Richmond City, Mr. Lupasi.
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. I move the adoption of the resolution.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Charlottesville.
Mr. Speaker, can this go by for the temporary so we can see the resolution?
Sure, without objection by temporarily.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
So state it.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, is this a new joint order? It is?
Yes,
Great. All right, if we could have it go by temporarily.
by temporarily. Okay. The House will be at ease. House will come to order.
Re-report.
The resolution has been reported. You'll have copies. Shall the resolution be agreed to?
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Charlottesville.
Parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of people in this chamber who have differing views about what it takes for the special order. Under Rule 52 of our rules, it states that the regular order of business shall not be changed, nor shall any special order be made, except by a vote of 2/3 of the members present. I
This-
just
this is
asked
a,
you a question before about whether this was a new special order, and the chair answered it was. So if this is a special order, Rule 52 does not require a two-thirds vote.
I've been advised by the clerk that this is a special order.
It's a
joint order.
Mr. Speaker,
Yes,
parliamentary inquiry.
yes.
Is not the special order that we passed a couple of weeks ago, did that not require two-thirds of vote under Rule 52 and the rules of the House?
This is a joint order.
The special and joint order, that's what they're called, I believe.
Budget is a special order.
Yeah.
This is under Rule 52. This is a joint order with the Senate.
Yeah, under Rule 52, this is a joint order with the Senate, requires a majority.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Then I state it.
Is not the joint order and a special order a departure from the regular order of business of the chamber? And does not Rule 52 say that the regular order shall not be changed without, nor shall any special order, and this is called a special and joint order, except by two-thirds?
Rule 52 clearly says that a joint order with the Senate requires a simple majority vote. That's how. Shall the resolution be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 64, noes 34.
Ayes 64, noes 34. The resolution is agreed to. The gentleman from Richmond City, Mr. Lapasi, will advise the Senate.
Maybe. They have different rules. They don't require two-thirds. That's however a majority votes.
The clerk will report a communication.
Communication from the Senate. The Senate has insisted on its amendments and requested a committee of conference on two House bills, House Bill 127 and House Bill 148.
The gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House acceded the request of the Senate for a committee of conference on the previously reported legislation.
As many as favor that motion will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. That motion is agreed to.
The Speaker appoints on behalf of the House for committee of conference on the two aforementioned bills. House Bill 127, delegates Knight, Ware, and Aird. Part of the House Committee of Conference on House Bill 127, delegates Knight, Ware, and Aird. For House Bill 148, Committee of Conference, the Speaker appoints delegates Fowler, Orrock, and Fillercorn. For House Bill 148, the Speaker appoints delegates Fowler, Orrock, and Fillercorn. In addition, the Speaker has two Further, conferees is putting for 2 Senate bills. For Senate Bill 445, comparable to one of the ones just reported, Speaker appoints delegates Fowler, Orrock, and Fillercorn. Senate Bill 445, delegates Fowler, Orrock, and Fillercorn. Finally, for Senate Bill 731, Speaker appoints delegates Jones, Cox, and Torian. For Senate Bill 731, delegates Jones, Cox, and Torian.
The gentleman from Albemarle, Mr. Bell.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to make an introduction.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, we have a group with us up in the gallery, and it is the Community Public Charter School of Albemarle County. Now, we had a lengthy debate about charter schools. They tried to get to us that day, but if you remember, that was a snowy day and they were snowed out. But they did pick a day when we've had all sorts of education issues to talk about. It's one of 9 charter schools in the entire state. It's their student government. So I would ask us to please give them a warm House welcome.
We're delighted to have the students with us today and hope you enjoy your time at the Capitol. Gentleman Shenandoah and Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for an announcement.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I know the clerk is going to announce this, but I wanted to elaborate. The full General Laws Committee is going to meet immediately upon adjournment. We have 1 bill. It shouldn't take very long, and then we can be done with it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You can meet at your desk.
Where we always meet.
Yeah. Clerk have any announcements?
Today's meeting schedule and tomorrow morning, as the chairman just announced, General Laws will meet immediately upon adjournment of the House in House Room C on the first floor of the GAB. All other legislative committee, subcommittee meetings for this afternoon are canceled. So the final activity this afternoon following General Laws would simply be the Virginia Transparency Caucus. They will be meeting at 4 o'clock in the 4th floor West Conference Room. That's a change in date and time. The Transparency Caucus, 4 o'clock, 4 West. And then at 5 o'clock, the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus will be meeting in the 6th floor Senate Leadership Conference Room. Looking ahead to tomorrow, Friday, March 4th, Finance Committee, Subcommittee number 3. That meeting has been canceled. So the first order of business tomorrow morning will be meeting of the Committee on Militia, Police, and Public Safety. They'll meet at 8 o'clock in House Room C. That's a change in time for MIPS, 8 a.m., House Room C over in the General Assembly building. The Ben Franklin Liberty Caucus meeting has been canceled tomorrow. The County, Cities, and Towns meeting tomorrow has been canceled. At 8 o'clock, the Capital Region Caucus will meet in the 8th floor West Conference Room, 8 a.m., Capital Region Caucus. Also at 8 o'clock, the New American Caucus will be meeting in the 5th floor East Conference Room. At 8:30, the Tourism Caucus, they'll be meeting in 5 West Conference Room. That's a change in time for them. Privileges and Elections Committee, they will be meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. in the 9th floor Appropriations Room. That's a change in time for House P&E, 9 o'clock up in the 9th floor Appropriations Room. And then the Democratic Caucus will meet at 9:30. House Room 2, the Republican Caucus at 9:30 tomorrow morning in House Room 1 here in the Capitol.
Gentleman, Prince William, Ms. Lingenfelder.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize to the clerk. Did the clerk announce that Militia, Police, and Public Safety will be meeting at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to consider 1 bill?
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. Militia, Police, Public Safety, 8 a.m. tomorrow, House Room C. Change in time, 1 bill.
The gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I move that when the House adjourn today, to adjourn to reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox moves that when the House adjourn today, to adjourn to reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Those opposed, no. That motion is agreed to. The gentleman from Colonial Heights.
Speaker, I move the House to now adjourn.
Gentleman from Colonial Heights, Mr. Cox moves the House to now adjourn. As many as favor that motion will say aye. Opposed, no. That motion is agreed to. The House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.